I teach in the Department of Anthropology here at NYU, and I just want to take a few minutes to share my pleasure at welcoming our speaker for today. Nancy Rees is a very distinguished anthropologist of the former Soviet Union, foremost known for her work in Moscow, but also for other parts of the former Soviet Union and the contemporary Russian Federation. She is possibly best known to some of you in the room, and among most of those who have read her work, for her landmark book from 1997 through Cornell called Russian Talk, Culture, and Conversation, Perestroika, if I remember that correctly. It was a magnificently written, wonderfully accessible, terribly smart look at not so much just a diagnosis of, as the title suggests, right, metropolitan Soviet and Russian life at the close of the Soviet period, but also a way of looking at Russian history itself through the ritual and thinking about all of the language, the turns of phrase, and the linguistic means by which people made sense of everyday life through historical genealogies. It has not been unnoticed by some of us who haven't made the same amazing benchmarks that Nancy has, that this has become one of the best-selling books, not only in the anthropology of the former Soviet Union, but on popular scholarship of contemporary Russia in general. It was, I don't know if it's still the case, but I knew from State Department friends about 10, 15 years back that it was assigned reading for all new State Department officials going to Russia as the single introduction that they offered to new government officials. If they had to read one book, this was the book they were going to read. Not everyone gets that kind of strange, ambivalent praise, right? But if anyone is going to, if I had to choose someone who was going to help guide the government officials whose taxes or whose salaries are paid by our taxes, I'm glad it was this book, because it was really one of the best books I know in its field. So then, of course, she's followed up with 20 years of excellent scholarship on the Russian mafia, foodways in Russia. One of the best-known prize-winning articles she has done with a tongue-in-cheek title is Potato Ontology, on the symbol of the potato in Russian culture and society. But of course, she's gone on to many other things. She is known to many of you here through a rather vivid online project on the Russian communal apartment, which was a real labor of love and a vast amount of work that is part of the popular outreach that she's well known for. But of course, today we're going to hear from some of the more recent work, which is again to think genealogically through a lot of the patterns that are going on in contemporary Russian news and politics. The title on the screen behind me, as you can see, is again the vivid title, Thugocracy, A Way to Think About Trump and Russia. So please join me in welcoming Nancy Rees.
Thank you so much, Bruce, for inviting me, and thank you to Joanne for hosting this. I'm delighted to be here. I'm very ambivalent about the State Department thing, so think about that. This talk actually comes out of what was completely unexpected burst of social activism and education that I've been doing. I live in a small town in the center of upstate New York, 2,000 permanent residents, and so I know everybody knows everybody, and I'm fairly politically involved. And so right after Trump was elected, between the election and the inauguration, the chair of the county Democratic Party organ invited me to come to speak to people in our community about all this Russia stuff. And the Steele dossier had come out, and BuzzFeed, and there was growing news. It's kind of hard to remember sort of how little people knew in the very end of 2016, but there were a lot of questions. So they asked me to give a talk, and I just put some thoughts together and gave a talk. About 200 people were there for that first one. And then that led to other people, first Democratic Party networks, but then some indivisible groups. in upstate New York, inviting me to reprise that talk. And so from between January of 17 to the present, I've given this talk in 17 different places. Many of those have been very small and divisible groups in little towns in upstate New York you've never heard of. But it has been really interesting to talk to people, not Russia specialists, not scholars, to talk to people about what is going on and to have a kind of venue to keep, as the news unfolds, and it's unfolding every single moment, to keep thinking about what's going on. So my arguments, my ideas, my understandings change literally every day. This week has brought a few new revelations. So, everything is in a state of flux. More than other scholarly projects, this is very much a work in progress. So please bear with me. There are lots of details and names in the slides. You are not meant, there will be no quiz. You're not meant to absorb all of that. It's more to give a sense of scale and just some of the complexity of the thing that I think is going on, which I call thugocracy. And it doesn't roll off the tip of the tongue. I did not invent this word, but I think it's a very good word to use for the current situation. And maybe by the time you leave, thugocracy will roll off your tongue a bit. So this is the sense of confusion. Names, places, events, meetings, and the public has this burning question: what does this all mean? What's going on? It's a kind of interesting problem to deal with as a scholar of Russia, at the same time as being very much a citizen of the United States and very concerned about the significance of the Trump presidency. So I'm trying to kind of get some kind of intellectual, academic, theoretical, scholarly purchase on this. Following the news, reading the news, using the news. I have students working for me, and we don't have the tools that Robert Mueller has, but we're trying to create databases to look at very specific things, and I'm writing about this, and so a number of the pieces of what we hope will be a book are present in this talk, as well as the overarching theoretical argument. So people follow the news, look at pictures like this, try to think about events that they're reading and hearing about and watching on television, and are wondering, what is going on in these meetings, for example? What are they talking about? What are they planning? Is it compromat? Does Putin have some compromising information on Donald Trump? Is this about a quid pro quo for sanctions relief for Russia? Is this about what happens in Syria? Is it, are they talking about the details of the Steele dossier? What's going on? Some of it is kind of funny. Some of it is kind of some of the theorizing that happens around these meetings is kind of outrageous and ridiculous. And yet we have a sense that something is going on. What is that thing that's going on? Why do they always seem to have a need to run off and find each other and discuss things in the corner on the side of some large transnational event? So this just came out a couple days ago in Financial Times that actually, even though it had been assumed that they did not meet at the G20 in Buenos Aires, actually Trump and Putin found some time after a meal and gathered in the corner with Melania and Putin's translator to have a conversation. Again, very much out of the ordinary in terms of government protocol. And Trump seems to be doing that over and over. So what's going on? What do they need to be discussing off in the corner? Is this hacking? So I'm performing this a little bit because this is the public discourse, right? This project is as much about the public discourse around Trump and Putin, Trump Russia, Trump Kremlin, as it is about Trump Kremlin, maybe more about the public discourse. Is it hacking? Was the election hacked? Are the Russians meddling in our political affairs? Are they interfering with our democracy? Is there some kind of collaboration? Is it collusion? Is there a conspiracy? Is it some kind of puppetry where Vladimir Putin is using kompromat to puppetize Donald Trump? And you've all seen the memes that make jokes about that. Is this about the deep, long, decades-old kompromat that the Soviets and the Russian Federation seem to have possibly gathered on Donald Trump? Is there some kind of, is Putin providing some kind of Krisha for Donald Trump? And we'll talk about Krisha again in a minute. So ultimately, the question is constantly being asked, was American democracy the innocent victim of Russian meddling in 2016? And of course, there's been a ton of media coverage of that question. Or is there some other way? Are there other ways to view this thing that seems to be happening? So I want to circle back. One of the things that this project has allowed me to do is to circle back to field work that I did in the 1990s, and I'll explain why in a minute. And a few weeks ago, I was looking through field notes from 1997, and just sort of scouring my field notes, trying to find a specific thing. And I stumbled on an interview with a guy in Moscow named Misha, a Russian chemist who had become a small entrepreneur. And he was telling me about the struggles of small businessmen. I was actually doing lots of interviews with businessmen, businessmen, in that year and then the previous couple of years. And so this was a standard sort of interview. And many of the interviews I did in that moment, people talked about mafia this, mafia that, the ways in which the mafia in the 1990s was impacting people's attempts to be entrepreneurs and to develop their businesses. So that was a common, constant piece of the conversation. So during the conversation, Misha, at one point, kind of jokingly, and I had taken pretty good notes on this, and I remember the conversation, he said, everything is mafia. One of the things people always said is that, the street mafia are the good guys, they help us out. The real mafia is the mafia up there, and they would point invariably in the direction of Moscow if they were outside of Moscow, or in the direction of the Kremlin if they were inside of Moscow. Вот там настоящий. So this was one of those kinds of conversations. There, over, don't look at the bandits on the street. Over there is the real mafia. That was something I heard hundreds of times, and so it sort of informs my my scholarship and my thinking. Misha said this, half jokingly. He said, looking ahead, может ли быть президент бандит? Might there someday be a bandit president? I couldn't believe I stumbled on this in my field notes. I was like, oh my God. That was 1997. My argument is that possibly we should think about the notion, and you can see that I'm hedging on this, that in fact, yes, maybe there are two banditi presidenti. Is that possible? What would it mean to look at the Putin presidency and the Trump presidency and the collaboration going on between them as the collaboration of two bandit presidents? Again, very much hedging this with scare quotes and a little bit of fuzziness, but I'll come back to this and see what you think. So this leads to the notion of thugocracy, and here's my working definition: a mode of governance or domination characterized by the legitimation of corruption, criminality, this is key, not just the existence of these things, but the legitimation of these things, the legitimation of corruption, criminality, elite privatization of public resources, authoritarianism, nationalism, masculinism, militarism, use of threat against domestic political adversaries and critics, and the overt use of the threat of war for geopolitical gain, and for domestic political gain, of course. So interestingly, this headline hit this week, just the other day, in the Moscow Times, that Russia moves to decriminalize unavoidable corruption following Putin's proposal. And I urge you to read this Moscow Times story to understand what unavoidable corruption is. I I still don't really understand it, but okay. But this is what I mean, a kind of strange project, a transnational project to legitimize corruption and criminal behavior by people in power, people in business, etc. In shorthand, to make crime not criminal. And what kind of project is that? So thugocrats, in this definition, work within loose networks of business, government, and criminal elites, and other elites, who facilitate their centralization of wealth, power, media control, and threat-making, and benefit from these, per se. Contemporary thugocracy, and this underlies everything here. Contemporary thugocracy is thoroughly and profoundly transnational. In other words, Russia does not invent it, Russia does not own it, Russia is not the master of it. If we go back in US history and think about it through the lens of thugocracy, we can see that thugocracy is pretty ubiquitous. And pretty much any polity you can find the thugocratic. It goes back a little bit to Tilley's argument, but I think we're in it's a slightly different scale than what Tilley was talking about. Of course, there's some wonderful scholarship on it. 3 books that have been helpful to me in recent months in thinking about this are Carolyn Nordstrom's wonderful Global Outlaws, Crime, Money, and Power in the Contemporary World, with fabulous details of about all of the commodities that are traded globally through shadow networks, and it's a quite surprising read. A slightly more dry edited volume on transnational organized crime with really interesting chapters on money laundering and things like that. And Janine Waddell's book, one of her many books on this kind of thing, Unaccountable, How Elite Power Brokers Corrupt Our Finances, Freedom, and Security. And Janine has been a really clear voice on this kind of stuff going back 20 years. And I'll come back to Jean a little bit. So my interest in some of the themes here stems from a period of fieldwork that I did in the Russian city of Yaroslavl in the 1990s. Beautiful World Heritage city on the banks of the Volga, and I'm sure some of you have been there. I went to Yaroslavl to study business entrepreneurs, businessmen, small businessmen, and the kinds of struggles that they face in developing their petty businesses. And so I landed there to do fieldwork in the summer of 1995 with a handful of contacts to use as, in this kind of ethnographic snowball method. And on the second day I was there, I had my first interview with a guy who sold soap out of the back of his car, washing powder. That was his business. And I did an interview with him, and at the end of the interview he said, would you like to meet some other business people? And of course, yes. I said, yes, please, I would love to. So he said, well, I'll put you in touch with a friend of mine, Alyosha. And the very next day, Alyosha called me and asked if I'd like to have lunch. And I said, of course, yes. And he said, well, I will come pick you up. And I said, I'll give you my address. And he said, no, I know where you live. So at noon the next day, I went downstairs in my to the entrance of my apartment, and there was this charming 30-something blonde guy, Alyosha, in a battered old Mercedes-Benz, black Mercedes-Benz. Ushered me into his car, drove me to a cafe. We walk into this little cooperative style, one of those tiny cafes that are kind of like what co-ops were like in the 80s, just a little hole-in-the-wall place. We go in, and the officiantka takes us, the waitress takes us through the restaurant into this back room without even asking. She just ushers us into this back room. And without even asking, she starts to bring food and lay the table with all kinds of treats, so we had a nice lunch. And I whip out my tape recorder, and I say, do you mind if I record this? Or, he knew it was an interview. He said, no, please don't record. So I put away my tape recorder, and I said, well, Alyosha, no, what kind of business are you in? What kind of business do you do? And he leaned across the table, smiling, charming guy, leaned across the table and smiled and said, yeah, Bunsies. I'm a bandit. That was the common slang for young mafia guys in a mafia gang. So, you're a bandit. Oh, well. So, ethnography teaches you that you just have to go with the flow. Whether, your interview that you expected to be an hour turns into 8 hours, or the interview with a businessman turns out to be an interview with a young bandit. Well, Alyosha, so, that's interesting. So tell me, what do bandits do in Yaroslavl? Do you ever have to threaten people or kill people? What's it like being a bandit? What does your mother think about you being a bandit? What does your wife think? And he answered all my questions. He said, my wife is fine with it. She understands it. It's the reality that we're in. Mother, not so much. Mama especially doesn't like it when I go sit in prison. You sit in prison? Oh yeah, but we all go sit. But the police are our friends. They take care of us. They brought me a nice soft mattress. It was all fine. They let me have my phone. That was the day of the early cell phones, and everybody, all the businessmen had cell phones. Okay, well, so we had a nice lunch. I did an interview. I ran to the bathroom and pulled out my notebook and wrote lots of notes. That's how you do it, like you can't use a tape recorder. And then Alyosha asked me if I would like to spend the day with him while he does his rounds. Well, of course. So we get back in his car and we spent the rest of that day, and then another day that I met up with him. He let me come with him twice. And he drove me around Yaroslavl while he did his rounds. So we visited several banks. We sat, I got to sit while they spoke bandit slang and with a couple of bankers, a couple of razborki, some arguments were going on in one place. We went to the brand new Ben & Jerry's that had just opened. We stopped in a couple of other little food stores. And we visited the brand new German-funded technological university, which was in a glorious old Yaroslavl palace, a mansion, 3-story building, and had just been completely refinished, and all of the marble had been refurbished, and the sparkling new technology. And we walk into this place, and we walk up the 3 flights of stairs, and we walk without being announced into the office of the vice, the rector. I was going to say vice chancellor, the rector. We just walked right past his huge antechamber, twice as big as this, with the 2 secretaries sitting there. Alyosha says hi to them, and we just walk right through, and he opens the door and walks right into the university rector's main office, which was this enormous, glorious thing with cushy chairs and oriental carpets. The rector greets us warmly, meets me, offers us cognac. We sit there for a couple hours having cognac and snacks, and while they discuss things again my Russian is pretty good and I can understand pretty well, but lots of slang that I didn't understand and rapid fire. So lots of it I couldn't get, but they were clearly doing work together. They were clearly doing projects. The second day that I drove around with him, we went to one place, and we actually brought his old Mercedes to an apartment building where we went into the basement. He pulls out a stack of $100 bills about this big. In the basement there was a money counting machine. It's sort of in the podval of an apartment building. There was a money counting machine. He puts the dollars in the money counting machine, counts them, and then we get back in the car and we meet some guy, and he gives the guy the money and the Mercedes, and we drive off in a brand new Jeep. An American Jeep. So things like that. Then after we picked up the Jeep, we pull into a parking lot, and across the parking lot there is a police car. And I'm thinking, oh great, this is probably not where I want to be. But instead, what happened is that Alyosha got out of the car and walked over to the police car, and they had a 20-minute conversation, very smiling and joking and fine. And he comes back to the car, and I say, well, so what's that about? And he says, oh, the police. They're always running out of bullets for their guns, and they can't buy them, and so we have access to bullets, and so we provide the bullets for them. Okay. So, do I take all of this with a grain of salt? Of course. I heard many, many other stories from Alyosha during those days, but I observed something with my own eyes, which was that, and I've written about this both in Russian Talk and in Honest Bandit. So if you want the full treatment of this whole story, it's in this essay, Honest Bandits. What was really helpful to me? Yes.
Can I just ask you, did you opine at all about why he was inviting you along? What was that for him? Why did he-
Yes, I think it was a joke. I think it was an in-joke with his friends. I think I was a 40-something American. I think it was interesting to him. I think he felt no threat in it. And I think he found it really interesting to have an interlocutor. He was a smart young guy, but I actually think, and I write about that in Honest Bandit's essay. Why did he let me do this? One of the things that he did, he brought me on the second day, he brought me out to a house, a dacha on the beautiful river. It didn't look like that. It looked a little more like that. Outside of Yaroslavl, and introduced me to his friends who were young musicians living in this dacha. And they became my friends, both in Yaroslavl when they were in the city and at the dacha, and I went to the dacha several times. And one day when I was out visiting them for the weekend at the dacha, the young woman, Lena, and I were playing badminton in our shorts in front of, right by the river, when 3 cars pulled up. And it was like a scene from a comedy. Out of the 3 cars spilled 10 guys in suits in July. And they were banditi, and suddenly it became, I'm a naive person. I realized that it was, the musicians were cover. It was a safe house. It was a really nice refurbished dacha. It had a pool table and a pool hall and, a nice kitchen. It was a place owned by somebody that they used for meetings. So these 3 groups of bandits from 3 different banditi from 3 different gangs gathered together, spent the day. Lena and I ran to the kiosk, bought everything at the kiosk, brought it home, cooked for them, made dinner for them, and they were there for 5 or 6 hours getting really drunk. And I was trying to just be quiet and stand in the back and not say very much so that they wouldn't notice me. Alyosha was actually there, and he was like, hi, but he didn't talk to me. The senior guy was about 5 inches shorter than me, broad shoulders, wearing a 3-piece suit. And at one point, he noticed me, and he came up to me and he said, so who is this? Кто это? And I said, меня зовут Nancy, я американка. And he said, what are you doing here? Who are you? What are you doing here? And I said, I always say I'm a sociologist because it's easier for people to understand what that might be. So, я социолог из Колгейского университета в Америке. And he said, so how do I know you're not from the CIA? And I said, well, I have my Colgate business card. And he just laughed. And he stood right in front of me and like this. And he said, and he was smaller than me, like this. He said, so let me just tell you, you see that river out there? And, the Volga River in Yaroslavl is really wide. You see that river out there? And I had told him I was from Chicago. He said, we'll do like they do in Chicago. We'll put your feet in concrete and drop you in the bottom of the river if it turns out you're not who you say you are. This was performative, and I knew at the moment it was happening that it was performative. When they got more drunk, and he wanted to show me how to be sexual as a real woman should, because he had heard things about how American women are in bed, I declined, and my girlfriend Lena escorted me to the bedroom and locked the door, where I spent the next few hours locked in the bedroom, but happily not being ganged up on by bandits. So why this is happening? Why it was kind of an accidental thing, but why it was really important and useful to me is that as I as I wrote it up, as I wrote my book, as I was, really thinking through the meaning of these encounters, I realized that I had gotten to experience, even just for a few days, on the streets of Yaroslavl, something about the modality of mafia power and what it feels like, the affect of it, what it feels like on the street. I witnessed the way that Alyosha used threat. There were some really clear moments where he was exercising threat, especially with this one woman banker. He talked a lot about how banditi do conflict resolution. So I listened to that whole narrative, that whole discourse, and I write about that in my essay. I also got drift of all of these complex money-making projects of many kinds and many levels of scale and complexity, so that supposedly, according to what they said, the banditi gathering at the dacha were actually designing some kind of truck hijacking project, that they were hijacking trucks on the border between Belarus and Russia, and they were hijacking electronics parts or something like that. Who knows what's actually going on? These are the stories that people were giving me. But I got to actually see and sort of have a sense of the affect around the horizontal and vertical networking that was happening for profit, mutual profit, and protection services, Krisha. So that if someone in a legitimate business was doing something quasi-legitimate, the banditi were providing Krisha both in the extortion sense, but also Krisha in the sense of kind of plausible deniability for different kinds of mafia connected projects. And of course, some of this involved money laundering. How do you take buckets of cash that you have from certain kinds of criminal projects and turn them into legitimate, useful capital? Right? It's that cash to capital thing that is a problem for all mafias and all business people and government agents doing unaccountable things, doing criminal things. If you read the Moscow Times story, there's a picture of an indicted governor of one of Russia's regions with piles of cash on the table in front of him, right? And if you spent time in Russia in the 90s or any part of the former Soviet Union in the 90s, you would see buckets of cash going to banks and things. So there was a lot of cash for legitimate business, but there was also a lot of illegitimate business, prostitution, drug dealing, gun running, and all kinds of other typical mafia operations. And of course, the word Krisha, the notion of Krisha, ends up being one of the really big takeaways from that period. That's still current, but used more for political cover, and that's a really important thing. So I also saw crucially that mafias connect networks. Mafias work in networks, filamental, small networks, but they also stitch together larger networks of business, police and intelligence agencies and officials, government officials, members of the judiciary, and elites of other sectors. Mafias, banditi, are the people who kind of travel in the interstices, and in that work that they do, stitch together different kinds of networks, often filamental, often 2 or 3 corrupt people, but stitched together through discrete projects to others who are engaging in discrete projects, also criminal or quasi-criminal projects. So coming back to the present, what is it that connects these two? How can we use what we understand about these modes of mafia operation to think about Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin? There's a set of practices, a modus operandi, a set of doxas or ideologies, and a kind of habitus. So here I'm really using a Bourdieuian framework to think about this. So thugocracy as a project and a mode of power has a habitus. It has its own style. It has certain ideologies. It has certain key practices, some of them very powerful, and it has critically a transnational scope with lots of mutual admiration and transnational collaboration. Thug or habitus or style has a gesture and an aesthetic, and we see this every single day in the modalities of Donald Trump. And a really interesting thing I'll come back to in the end is how often people talk about him as being a thug, being a gangster, having a gangster style, right? That discourse around Trump is important to capture, to pay attention to. People, even without a theory of the case, people are noticing this and are thinking about Trump's thugocratic gesture and aesthetic. Thugs have many key practices, and this is a very long list. It could be longer, and the list is sort of organized from street-level extortion, really rudimentary mafia practices, to the highest levels of contemporary transnational criminal, organized and semi-organized practice. Cybercrime and cyber hacking. Most of the banditti now are not on the street in battered Mercedes. They're behind a computer somewhere in Moscow, in New York, London, Tokyo, Prague, Budapest, Delhi, wherever you name it. The networks are now much less likely to be on the street and more likely to be internet. You can understand how many discrete practices fit into these kinds of things. The doxer are ideology, masculinist, nationalist, ethno-nationalist, and sometimes quite racist. And critically, and I write about this in my Bandits article, cynicism is a value. So that's a doxa, but it's also a part of the habitus. Practicing, performing cynicism is a critical part of thugocratic behavior. And that cynicism includes performed, vivid contempt for the common good, for the public good, right? An actual set of practices of discourse that shows utter contempt for the kinds of things that regular day-to-day people see as being part of the common good. Thugocratic pet projects. Many of these are large-scale and cleanish, right? The goal of thugs is to become thugocrats. Right? The goal of thugs is to launder not just your cash into capital, but your image into respectability. It's all about that image of respectability and the laundering. And so large-scale projects like real estate, entertainment projects are a huge, huge crossing point for transnational organized crime money-making. There's just a thing about a big sporting event. It's the Super Bowl in Atlanta. And there's just a thing in the New York Times this week about how they're trying to control for sex trafficking and prostitution around the Super Bowl. Mega events of every kind, sporting events and Miss Universe type events are critical sites for all kinds of cash-related criminal activities to be taking place, and ultimately they need to be laundered and turned into respectability. Natural resources extraction and trade is the other really big, large-scale transnational thugocratic project, set of critical financial operations. Thugocratic governance has certain dimensions, it relies on creating a kind of civic war, whether that's discursive and mediated or actual and physicalized. It relies on creating chaos, creative chaos generation as a method of governance, disrupting a sense of what's normal, of what's expected, creating a sense of political absurdity. And if you spent time in Russia in the 90s, or even the late 80s, one of the key words was that everything is absurd, right? That normal life has become absurd. This sense, this sort of really destabilizing sense of absurdity and chaos is crucial. And when you experience this, thugocracy is succeeding. It's also, and perhaps this is key in terms of large-scale projects, is state capture, siphoning off as many public resources as you possibly can, whether it's selling oil and gas rights in places that have been held sacred and off limits, especially those. That's both performative, that goes back to there is no common good, there is no public good. We're going to turn, these sacred Native American sites into sites for gas drilling and extraction, right? Those are both practical money-making ventures and as well performative chaos-making stamps of thugocratic behavior. It's creating legislation to favor cronies and partners rather than public transparency. And we see this every single day. It's carving out favored access to natural resource sectors. Can I take questions at the end? Would that be okay? Because there's a lot that I still have to get to. I don't want to. Carving out access to natural resource sectors for your cronies, your partners, your buddies, your friends, other banditti, other thugocrats. If you think about what happened in the entirety, really, of the former Soviet Union, the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, all of these things apply. This is Russia in the 90s, right? There are many other factors, but these kind of narrow them down to certain thugocratic principles. If you think about the governance that the United States is experiencing right now, all of these things are central to the operation of Trumpian thugocracy. As Jonathan Chait put it in New York Magazine last year, the thugocrats like helping themselves to the public till. The public till, even more than natural resource extraction or any other sector of operation, opening the public till to thugocratic sucking. I think of it as a giant thugocratic vacuum sweep that just sucks up the common good, whether it's tax breaks or things that actually open the governmental resources to criminal enterprises. They help themselves to the public till. The enemies of thugocracy, and as you see who are the enemies of Trumpism, who are the enemies of Putinism, you know that those are the things that block thugocratic operation from developing to its furthest possible extent, right? So the enemies of thugocracy are the rule of law. Law is evil in a thugocratic worldview, right? You have to set out to destroy the law. Think about this as you hear the next Bruce Orr story, the ways in which investigators, lawyers, public legal officials, judges, etc., are tarred in thugocratic language. It's critically important. Civil society, indivisible groups, or any other NGOs that are operating to try to protect the public good are the enemy of thugocracy. Journalistic and legal investigators with a free press, fourth estate, are critical enemies of thugocracy. And transparent governance. Do whatever you can do, build in whatever you can build in to create shadows where there should be transparency, create opacity, create confusion. These are basic thugocratic principles. And resistance. Ridicule resistance. Turn the resistors into the targets of your ridicule. So what links these two? Coming back and back and back to that question. Thugocratic habitus, doxa, and practice. Thugocratic projects and principles, for sure. But there's also this weird parallel career thing with Trump and Putin. And this is probably not going to be what you're expecting me to say. Parallel careers, and I'll get to that in 2 seconds. As well critically as intertwined networks. These are really complicated things to unpack with a ton of names and places and events and times. I'm not going to go into the details. There are lots of details out there, thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of data points, millions perhaps of data points at this moment, but all of them discreetly well worth investigating. Of course, the internet has gone a little bit insane with these things. And so you can see, this is my favorite one. This is actually, if you go to this website designed by Brian Friedenberg, a freelance journalist, all of these on the website are actually clickable, and it's a pretty well organized way of getting into some of the most important lines. But you can see that it's also sort of impossible. You have to have a kind of perfect memory to even go into this, because you get lost in 2 seconds. But that getting lostness is that confusion, that like, what is this? How can this even be a reaction that we have when we go into these networks and try to do some of these, follow some of these really complicated sets of relationships? That confusion is part of the thing. It's part of the phenomenon itself. Okay, so I said, though, that we're going to look at parallel careers. So let's look at the career first of Silovik #1, Vladimir Putin. Most people think, and if you follow the news discourse about Putin, the analysis is, to understand what's going on, you have to understand that Putin is through and through a KGB agent, right? He's just a spy. That's who he is. KGBizhnik, right? Of course, that's important. I think it's essential. It's really interesting to look at that. But what they almost always miss, and at least in the mainstream coverage and conversations about Putin, is that Putin has a second career. He comes back from Dresden, and he is still a kind of a Silovik. He's still doing some data gathering on people at St. Petersburg University for a little bit. So he's using his spy background pretty well. But he also, as was happening so often in the late 80s and 1990s, with the huge release of Siloviks, of various kinds of intelligence agents from, they were relieved of their job. They were, as the joke used to go, they were freed of their jobs, right? And Vadim Volkov has some wonderful data on this in Violent Entrepreneurs. Lots and lots of intelligence agents become mafiosi, basically, become banditi, or start doing projects with banditi. So that was a thing, a very big thing in the 1990s. But the notion, I'm not saying Putin was a bandit, and I think that this guy, Maxim Fridzon, says this pretty well. The idea that Vladimir Vladimirovich was some sort of authoritative minister is extremely exaggerated. And some in the media, in the Twitter feeds and so forth, are saying this. And I think that Fridzon is right. This is exaggerated, maybe by Putin himself, right? That doxa praxis habitus thing between Silovik and bandit is very, there's a lot of overlap there, right? The reality, though, Fridzon says, was more prosaic. Putin definitely worked a lot and productively with bandits. He served them and tried to be useful to them. I've done a couple of interviews in the last year, and this is borne out by people who were business people in St. Petersburg at that particular moment. Putin was well known. If you were operating in certain neighborhoods, in certain places, Putin's projects were very well known. So let's just revisit Putin's Petersburg career. From 1990 to 96, he was the head of the Committee for Foreign Liaison. He was the first deputy. He held a number of positions at once, as it was common then. First deputy head of city administration, among other titles. And he was in charge of the State Property Management Office and the import-export licenses in St. Petersburg. Working with his old mentor from Leningrad University, Anatoly Sobchak, who was later accused of many crimes. Basically, what these jobs gave Putin were a critical, perhaps unprecedented in access mode of operation on the privatization schemes going on in the very, very wealthy city of St. Petersburg in the 1990s. A moment of what Russians call privatizatsiya, grabbing, making a little joke of privatizatsiya and calling it privatizatsiya. the capture of public goods. And I just illustrate this just as a mode of illustration, that massive transformation in the 1990s of the public-owned goods into privately held goods. This is happening at every level, whether it's some mansion in St. Petersburg, and Putin was very active in dealing with the city-owned property and helping to privatize that, but also the privatization of commodity sectors, industrial sectors, natural resource sectors, state-owned property and real estate, and in charge of transnational contracts, treaties, and projects. It's instructive to read Janine Waddell's book, Collision and Collusion, though, about everything that was happening in the 90s. This was transnational. This privatizacja was, of course, helped and abetted by, and Russian citizens do not forget this at all, by the Harvard boys, by the U.S. government, by U.S. government agencies working under Bill Clinton, and by critically by scholars and people in think tanks. So I just throw that in as something that's happening simultaneously, and it's a critical part of all of the privatization that's going on. So let's note that in Putin's Petersburg career, one of the aftermaths of that, or one of the things that happened as part of that, was that he became the target of multiple investigations for corrupt practices, capital exportation, money laundering, property privatization, the raiding of companies, gambling licenses, collaboration with criminal organizations. Karen DeWisha has written about this pretty extensively in chapter 3 of her wonderful book, Putin's Kleptocracy. Very worth reading and understanding this really complex story of all of the charges that were leveled, the investigations that were being conducted against Putin, and how ultimately he escaped all of them. This is one of his close collaborators, Gennady Petrov, a really big Petersburg bandit, head of the Tambov gang, who was arrested in Spain in 2008, but then ultimately released. I think he's back in Russia. I don't think he's caught right now. So Putin goes to Moscow, where he becomes deputy chief of the Presidential Property Management Department. Right, parallel careers in real estate in the 90s. Okay, that's the parallel that I'm trying to point out here. He becomes the deputy, he goes through all of these different roles and moves up and gets closer and closer to the center until he's appointed as acting president at the turn of the millennium, and becomes the person who faithfully provides Krysha protection for the Yeltsin clan, so that the Yeltsin family will never be indicted. And then goes on to be president several times. Of course, just before he takes over as president in late 1999, are the apartment buildings, performative violence is never far away from Putin, especially as he becomes politically really central. And just to remind us of the assassination just of political figures and journalists in the last 20 years. The Friends of Vladimir Putin, again, one of those memes. There are thousands of them. You can follow them. Who is Putin connected to? DeWisha's really good on this. It gives you a really excellent sense of the ways that Putin is embedded in different networks and what those all means. Hundreds of friends and partners, allies who control state sectors, seemingly at Putin's bidding or under Putin's Krysha. Of course, he got really good at personal property, and if you followed both the Navalny reports and the report that Boris Nemtsov completed was almost completed just before he was assassinated. There's you can easily find it online if you look up Nemtsov Putin property. A detailed account of Putin's property, including planes, automobiles, boats, ships, submarines, etc., but critically focusing on 20 plus housing estates, including the biggest one on the Black Sea, just to the edge of the Azov Sea and Kerch Straits there, overlooking Crimea. This is a really, really interesting thing to look at, and you notice that it's a very high hill, and it goes all the way down to the Black Sea, where he parks one of his little submersibles and several of his yachts. I also think it's critical. This is a different project, but this is a bunker. There's housing for hundreds, food, and this is a bunker. Keep that in mind. And I think that's important. I don't know why that's important. Okay, so let's jump to Brighton Beach, New York, and think about Fred Trump, Donald Trump's father and mentor. And if you've been to Brighton Beach, you know very well that the Trump projects are right there at the heart of Brighton Beach. Trump spent his young years as a real estate maven, even as a teenager, collecting coins from the washers and dryers in his father's projects. That's where it all starts. It's right there in Brighton Beach. So who are the friends and mentors and teachers of Donald Trump? Lots has been written about this, but the lawyer and fixer and bandit Roy Cohn was his critical. He says this himself in his autobiographies. His critical mentor, who taught him his political practices, taught him, I argue, how to be a thugocrat. And Cohn was often working right at the edge of what was legal and often being indicted. Ultimately, he lost his law license. This is the same Roy Cohn who was the key advisor, mentor, and legal advisor to Joe McCarthy during the McCarthy hearings. Right? There is this long unbroken genealogy from that era and possibly from before. Cohn, while being a kind of thugocrat, working with political figures, was also famously working with the heads of mafia organizations in New York and New Jersey. And this is well documented. Trump supposedly met some of these people in Cohn's office in Long Island. And they end up being crucial in his early real estate projects. He could not have built Trump Tower without John Cody, a Teamster racketeer, and Paul Castellano, who helped him to get the concrete that he needed to build concrete building rather than a steel building. There's a ton of ink spilled on this, some of it very reliable, some of it less reliable, but it's very, very well documented by journalists writing in the 1980s about this new star on the New York real estate scene, Donald Trump. David K. Johnson's, I think, really reliable. It's all very well sourced. So these are just a few of the names of mafia figures who were critical in Trump's early career, and there's a story behind every single one of those names and connections. Just to give you a little, an image of someone. This is Joseph Joey Nosak Cinque at Mar-a-Lago in 2014. He was president and CEO of American Hospitality Services, worked a lot on Trump hotel projects, but he was also an indicted trafficker in stolen art, an insurance fraudster, and a large-scale drug dealer. Right? So these are laundered personalities, right? People who operate out in the open doing legitimate business, but also simultaneously carrying on all kinds of criminal enterprises. And this has been written about. I think Sidney Blumenthal's essay in the London Review of Books from last year was 2 years ago now was really good. Trump also structured, from the very beginning, he learned practices for structuring his companies for the greatest degree of unaccountability. He's a master, perhaps the American master of shell companies, of limited liability corporations. This is a chart of more than 500 business entities in real estate, golf, media, air transport, and licensing, real estate licensing agreements in the Trump organization. It's just impossible to even get your head around this. You know, how a fairly small number of people operate such a complex set of LLCs. The key thing, and this is critical in money laundering science, the science of uncovering money laundering, is that you launder money by placing it in various ways, by washing it through usually real estate. Real estate is the #1 best way to launder large amounts of cash and turn them into usable legalized capital. But you also do this, and this is exactly what at the heart of the Trump Organization model is using LLCs that overlap with or contain other LLCs and then other LLCs. So it's like LLCs all the way down. So that it's very hard to figure out who owns what, where the money's coming from, and where it's going. This is the heart of the Trump model. I'll just throw it the Krisha to think about Krisha as a model for this. So when is a building not a building? I would argue, and I think many others, I'm not the first one by any means to argue this, that buildings are not buildings when they're money laundering devices. A lot has been written about this, or when they're telephones. And I think about the meetings in July of 2016 in Trump Tower. Trump Tower, if you read memoirs that deal with people in Trump Tower is inherently a place where people get on elevators and go up to Trump's office, which has an open door policy, and create projects, right? There's a lot of communication going on there that's not by phone, that's not by email, that's not by text, right? There's face-to-face conversation inside Trump Tower to do all kinds of different things. So when is a building not a building? Well, when it's full of mafiosi and money launderers. And there are long lists easily available of people who lived, who not, maybe they didn't live, often they didn't live, who bought apartments in Trump Tower. And who were often later convicted of various crimes, money laundering, gambling. The first person that we know of who did this on a large scale is a guy named David Bogatin, a very petty, maybe not petty, mid-level Russian emigre, Brighton Beach gangster who joins up with El Cosa Nostra, Italian mafia in New York, in a gas embezzlement or gasoline tax evasion scheme. It's so complicated. If you spend the whole day reading about it, you still won't understand it. It's supposed to be complicated. But basically, there were these networks of El Cosa Nostra Mafia who figured out that if you bought gas one place and you sold it in another place, you basically launder it in a way to make it non-taxable, and you could make millions and millions of dollars. And Bogatin got in on this with those Italian Cosa Nostra Mafia in New York, not all of them Italian. He was ultimately indicted and charged on this, and the apartments that he had bought, 5 apartments that he bought in Trump Tower, all on one day, with Trump in the closing. So Trump was there with Bogatin to close on these apartments. This is money laundering. Trump Tower, as David K. Johnston points out, Trump Tower was only the second building in New York that allowed non-disclosed buyers to purchase real estate. That's critical in money laundering. It goes on to become, in New York, in Miami, in London, many other parts of the world, to become a more and more and more normalized thing that you can buy property without designating the owner, right? Lots of governments are now trying to walk that freedom back, so that because they know that real estate is the #1 money laundering, where'd my picture go? Money laundering device. There's lots of articles about Trump Tower, Panama City as a money laundering project for Russian and South American, Central American gangsters. Trump Soho, which Krisha, this is Trump's Krisha, when Cyrus Vance Jr. drops the indictments against Ivanka and her brothers for the mafia activity organized by Trump and Felix Sater to build Trump Soho, and that's of course right down the road. It's now no longer Trump, it's got the name taken off, right? And also Trump Tower Baku, New Yorker article last year, really good article about how this half-finished project is really a vehicle for money laundering. If you look at the Wikipedia page about Trump's real estate, you'll see this amazingly long list of projects, finished finished, half finished, and started but never really built. And it's really clear that they're all about money laundering. They're not actually about buildings that for people to live in. Craig Unger, journalist, has been a little bit too out there in the news lately, but this article is actually really good and really well sourced. I recommend it highly. It's in the New Republic Online. Okay, so let's just pop for a second. As all of this is going on, as Trump is learning in the 1980s and the 1990s, is learning to create real estate projects that are really money laundering opportunities and large scale money laundering. He comes into notice by a lot of Russian emigres with dirty cash. Let's put it bluntly. This is exceedingly well documented. David Bogatin was the first, but only the first of many, many. At the same time that that's happening, so that starts happening in the mid-'80s. Bogatin is 1984. It starts happening in the mid-'80s. Trump is becoming a persona. He's becoming more and more out there. And he becomes acquainted with Yuri Dubinin in New York when Dubinin was the Soviet ambassador. Dubinin invites him on an all-expenses-paid trip with his first wife Ivana to the Soviet Union, and he spends 11 days in Moscow and St. Petersburg scoping out sites for Trump Moscow, and he visits a bunch of sites, and he goes, I have to imagine, knowing his aesthetic, I have to imagine that he loved the Winter Palace, and that's the only picture that's easy to find of this journey. So here's a really strange thing that happens. He comes back. That trip is in mid-July. Leaves on July 4th. He comes back, and in September he buys ads. The cheapskate Donald Trump spends $100,000 buying ads in the three top U.S. newspapers, giving a vague sense of his desire to run for president. He says he's not interested in running for political office, but maybe in New York, but maybe the presidency. And he bought these 3 ads basically criticizing this is 1987, criticizing American allies for not paying what they should pay. Japan was at the top of his list at that time, not paying what they should pay for American protection. It's really interesting to read this ad in the context of everything that has happened today. Another thing that happens around this time, Trump has known Paul Manafort since the 70s, introduced through Roy Cohn. Manafort gets together with Trump and tries to explore a presidential bid for Donald Trump in around 1988. Okay, so that whole Trump-Manafort presidential thing is happening now. But a lot of people have wondered, who said what to Trump when he was in Moscow? He came back and gave interviews about nuclear weapons, for example, and he was really, not sort of talking in ways that were not very Trumpy. Okay, so back to the gangsters, though. This is all happening around the same time. In the 90s and early 2000s, Trump's Russian gangster networks grow and incorporate 3 really famous, vivid gangsters. Probably not really very big mafiosi in the larger scheme of things, but still kind of vivid presences. Alimjan Tahunov, who helped to run a gambling ring out of Trump Tower, a big gambling ring out of Trump Tower in the early 2010s. He got wind that he was going to be indicted and he fled, and he now lives in Moscow, where he showed up at Miss Universe 2013. I have a picture. Vyacheslav Yaponchik Ivankov, the famous gangster who's probably more of a performer than an actually good gangster, ends up also associated with Trump, living for a while in Trump Tower, living in the casinos, as does Semyon, the most famous Russian gangster of all, Semyon Mogilevich. And everybody now, the really wacko, far-out people are now saying Mogilevich owns Trump. I don't think that's true at all, but I do think that Mogilevich's money laundering schemes helped to create the gigantic money laundering real estate enterprise, the transnational enterprise that we're all caught in. I think we're caught in that enterprise.
Trump's key mentors, right? These are his early mentors, and then of course we get Steve Bannon a little bit later. And here are some other mentors and business partners who really help him scale things up. Felix Sater at the center, Brighton Beach kid, best friend from childhood of Michael Cohen, both totally immersed in Russian and post-Soviet Russian, Eurasian, Ukrainian mafia networks, filamental networks. I don't think they're running gangs, right? I don't think there are gangs. I think these are opportunistic, networked bandits, basically. And Sater is the guy who helped to create Trump Soho. Also worked with is the key guy who tried to get Trump Moscow, the Moscow Project, the most recent iteration of the Moscow Project, going. And he traveled to Moscow with Ivanka and Don Jr. About 8 years ago. So these are generating, all of this activity is generating a lot of public discourse. Some of it is great and really interesting and really well sourced, and some of it is way out there. I let you read it for yourself. It's interesting. There's a discourse. It ends up results in these kinds of exercises, these kinds of charts. They're all very interesting, and you can grab some data from them, but I think they miss the point. These parallel careers, these intertwined networks, and here's just a short list of Russian figures who have been involved with Trump, or one degree of remove from Trump in various Trump businesses. Large-scale, complex, quasi-criminal network ties, intertwined personnel, mysterious meetings, really strange joint ventures, and a certain kind of politics. Leads us to mafia talk. This is the discursive point. The 90s and the project that I did in the 90s was all about how people use mafia to talk about things they don't understand. They don't understand what's going on as the society, as the economic, social, ideological, cultural, political elements of their society are being shaken up, and they see privatization happening and producing wealth out of nothing. They see the top business leaders and government officials getting massively rich while the population gets poor. And mafia is a critical form of explanation. It's a kind of grounded theory. It's what I call local theory, people's way of making sense of this. And again, it's not the banditi, it's not the bandyugi that you see on the street, right? It's not these street guys. These are just our 20-something local guys, sportsmanly, right? This is what people would say. It's not those bandyugi. That's not what's really happening. It's those mafiosi up there, unaccountable, transforming our polity, transforming our society, transforming everything. But now we have the same kind of discourse here, and we can learn something from this. The people I talk to, the women, they're mostly older women who come to the indivisible groups that I speak to. They have this sense of some kind of mafia-like thing that's happening, and they don't understand what it is. It emerges in things like Comey's book that he published after being fired by Trump, where he has this chilling paragraph, and whatever you think of Comey's participation in all of this. The silent circle of assent, the boss in complete control. He's describing his visits to Trump in the Oval Office. The loyalty oaths, the us versus them worldview, the lying about all things in service to some code of loyalty that put the organization above morality and above the truth. Comey's describing his interactions with real Cosa Nostra gangsters that he helped to roll up in his earlier career, and he's saying that he feels the same thing when he visits Trump in the Oval Office. It's also out there in other ways. You can hear it, now you're going to hear it all the time. People use the word thug all the time to talk about what Trump is doing. So this was last week, or January 4th, on MSNBC had a town hall with Nancy Pelosi. And Joy Reid asks, what do you think of the president's relationship with Vladimir Putin? Speaker Pelosi says, I think that the president's relationship with thugs all over the world is appalling. And it's critically interesting that she says that, but what I find even more interesting is how the audience erupts, and they applaud a lot during this town hall because they're there because they like Nancy Pelosi. But what's really interesting is the sort of fervent applause that greets her saying that thing about the thugs. I think we need to follow that discourse. So I'm just going to end with this. Two separate quotations, one from Federico Varese, who wrote a wonderful book on the Russian mafia, and one from Laura Putnam and Theda Skocpol, essay from last year. So Varese asks, one need not ask whether the Russian mafia is bad for society, that we know. We should ask whether the remaining institutions of authority, which are supposed to enforce universal rights and secure protection to the Russian people, behave according to a logic entirely different from those of the mafias. Doubts remain. These are the last words of the book. It's a little complicated what he's saying, but he's getting at something really important. And then Putnam and Skocpol ask, in this really interesting essay about how women of a certain age, like mine, over 60, are at the heart of the anti-Trump resistance in the United States. And I have seen that because every time I go to these meetings, there'll be maybe a dozen, maybe 3 dozen, once 200. But there are probably 3/4 women over a certain age at those meetings, asking really great questions. So Putnam and Skocpol say, for those wondering, so this is to leave you with a little bit of hope of how you cut through thugocracy. For those wondering who is going to rebuild the foundations of US democracy, the answer across much of the heartland seems clear. The foundation rebuilders in many communities are newly mobilized and interconnected grassroots groups, led for the most part by Middle America's mothers and grandmothers. They see the work to be done and are well into accomplishing it. I hope their hope is grounded. We can see what that resistance looks like, and I'm part of that resistance. I think it's really important for us to participate in figuring out all of the many ways to take on democracy. Thank you.
We are pledged to this space until 2 o'clock, but that leaves some time for questions. And I'll leave that to our speaker.
Yes.
Hi. Thank you so much for your talk. I wanted to ask about something you mentioned earlier, which was about the way that, like, part of the either the praxis or the habitus of thugocracy is to like cultivate a veneer of respectability, right, and to look respectable and correct. And I was wondering what you think of the idea that this also goes the other way, like in particular when you mentioned the international nature of all these networks. I was thinking, the thing I immediately thought of was the movie Network. And that scene where like the main character is getting debriefed about the nature of essentially international corporate capitalism, and he's told, like, there are no nations, there are just corporations, and those are the networks that matter. And so I'm wondering whether the like thuggish nature of much of what you're describing is not a bug, but a feature of the way that especially the economy has been functioning globally since the 80s.
Mm-hmm. So this is a whole set of slides that I took out because the talk's already too long, as you see. Is tracing that these national and transnational, clean, well laundered corporate entities and their participation in this whole thing. So you could make a really, really big slide full of, you know, the Mercers probably would take first place on my slide, but of hundreds of corporate entities that have provided support, a lot of media entities, obviously Rupert Murdoch, longtime friend of Trump and supporter of Trump's project. So extractive capital, private military, Eric Prince, right, Blackwater, cyber companies working like Cambridge Analytica and its parent company, SEL, working on working at that place where legal and illegal
Exactly.
meet and where legal and illegal haven't fully been resolved because we're dealing with new technologies. I think probably the thing to watch is, the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg is probably a really small scale and pathetic version of this, but large scale PSYOPs organizations, PSYOPs companies, like Cambridge Analytica, SCL, and the many other companies like it that have been developed, and many of which are part of Trump's networks. So Joel Zamel, and there's a bunch of stuff about these Wikistruts and different companies that are trying to do the same thing, basically gaming elections in the way that the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg did, right? So I think it goes back to the same kind of outline of what's important. Massive liberation of resource extraction protocols, right? The complete washing away of regulation, right? And so the story on the Russian side or the former Soviet side is a little different because the regulations were never very, they were in flux in the transition period. But on this side and in other parts of the world, sweeping away regulations is the number one thing that resource extractors are interested in, and also, creating ways to turn public into private. That is absolutely corporate. So I'm really sorry not to. That would have been another 20 minutes of already way too long talk to get into that. But that's critically important. Maybe essential to the whole story. Yeah. So there's somebody in the back, and then.
Right, sorry. So I'm from the British mission to the UN.
Could you speak a
So
little
I'm
louder?
from the British mission to the UN, so I found your presentation incredibly interesting. We share obviously a lot of your analysis as we use. The UK has over the past year and a half tried to figure out why Russia sends such interesting tourists to us, which we can figure out. So don't get it full. Just three sort of differences that hopefully give you first thing it says Trump includes a load of parallels, that's some interesting areas where they diverge. The second is the different systems each man operates in and final performance and get you with other drivers. So I think on the first one we'd say that from our analysis of Trump, he's small time, no offense to the Americans, but compared to Putin in terms of political operator, he is very, very small time. The guy's been handed a silver chalice, he's come from money, he's figured out real estate, and yes, he's got no morals and no scruples, which will appeal to Putin, but that's like putting a somewhat sketchy lizard in front of a fox. I mean, Putin was in the government as a KGB officer for a number of years. He's worked in government service. He's figured out the levers, the power, and how he meshes it all together. So the first point I'd make is that I don't think there's a meeting of minds. We very much see Putin seeing Trump thinking, this is Christmas. Like this guy, all he'll have to do is basically use his narcissism against him, and then he's gonna fall into like that. The second thing is the systems. Your systems will hopefully, we like to think, endure Trump. So Trump's probably a frustrated autocrat because he's trying to do stuff, and he realises that the US system will push against him because he hasn't got the part. He'd love to be Putin, but I'd still like to think he's not going to get there. The final thing, the difference will be the drivers. Whereas Putin is very interesting with the corruption stuff. I would say that from our knowledge of the Soviet system, they've always had a great economy. From whenever you join government service, because the system hasn't been that good at paying people, there's an expectation that if you become a foreign minister, you pay for that post, and then you use that post to then recoup your money and then earn some on the top. I think from our view, what's changed is Perestroika opened up this huge globalization, opened up this foreign money, and what Putin did is he operationalized that. So I think the drive is slightly different in that, in my honest opinion, I don't really think Trump cares about America. I think Trump cares about being really great president, but that's all for himself. I think there is an element in Putin that's annoyed about how Russia was emasculated in Perestroika and then came to power, and he's come out through, Trump's gone to war with your intelligence community, Putin's embraced the intelligence community, he's still surrounded by people who know foreign policy. So there is an element to his driver that he wants to restore Russia's greatness on the world stage. that is why they went to Syria, partly. That's why they came to Crimea. So our view is that there's a bit of Putin that will look at business and think, you are surrogate to me. I will operationalise business in order to promote my foreign policy, because I don't think Putin's in that space.
So I agree with almost everything you said. One point I think to think about is that Putin is an incredibly smart, strategic, self-disciplined, knowledgeable operator of a fairly poor country with terrific natural resources to exploit, but nevertheless really significant social poverty and inequality, and political challenges that that will eventually. Whereas Trump is a strangely incoherent and yet coherent, like going into this project, finding, seeing that he's saying the same thing in 1987 that he's saying in 2019, a kind of brilliance and a kind of coherence that we ignore at our own peril. And that Trump is the weak, let's say, president of a really, really powerful state, of a really wealthy state, that has, strong governance. The U.S. has its own shadow economy. Carolyn Nordstrom is really good on these points. So let's, I don't entirely agree with that distinction, but but what Trump is doing in a concerted way, I think, driven by Mercers and Murdochs and a number of other very smart ideologues and business operators, is to radically and rapidly undermine the operation of U.S. governmentality. And I think we should all be very alarmed at the degree to which in 2 years he has succeeded in that project of eviscerating agencies of governance, and especially of intelligence investigation. I mean, just look at what's been going on this week. So that you've got a kind of a weak country and a strong leader and with lots of experience, and a wealthy, powerful country with pretty good democratic governance, and this pretty strange Trump. So, yeah, we can't predict the future where that will take us. But,
One last
thank you
question.
very much for coming. Yes.
Hi, I'm Barbara Cass from the Stern School. I just have a question about how this thugocracy works when you talk about natural resource extraction. How do you separate out the fact that issues of relaxation of regulation and drilling in various places that most of us would not like to see drilled, these have been part of the polity in the Republican Party for years. What has that got to do with Trump?
Well, so another set of slides and chapters is the Roger Stone stuff coming out. If you haven't watched, what is it, The Education of Roger Stone? The documentary about Roger Stone that came out last year. It's really good, and you should watch it. The heritage from, on the political advisor, political lobbyist and political electioneering companies, the heritage from Manafort, Stone and Black through to the present, and the other companies, they were really the first, but the other companies, American and transnational, that have grown up around that model to the present, and its influence and impact on the GOP for decades and decades is really important part of this story. And that's a whole separate genealogy. Alongside that genealogy, there are several others. The development of political PR and the transnational PR agents, Burson Marsteller and Manafort, that part of Manafort's work, which is about shaping public relations, that whole story of American PRs, from Bernays to the present, and how that has been transnationalized for political purposes globally is really important, and that is always about natural resource exploitation and unaccountable use of resources. Yeah.
one more, I think Bruce is standing up.
No, I please. it's not-
I'm Ann Lounsbury, I'm Sharon Rushman's mother. I'm wondering why it is you think that older women in particular are tuned into these issues and taking them more seriously.
Well, so I ask them that when I go to these events, who are you, where are you coming from? A lot of them are hippies. You know, they were politically active in their youth and their young adulthood, and they're now, you know, retired, on the verge of retirement, and they're still kind of have a habitus from the late 60s and the 70s. They're feminists. So they're alarmed by the misogyny in all of this, and I think that it's that feminism and environmentalism, and their concern about climate change that is bringing them out. I think probably the misogyny is what drives them in the beginning of this, the rolling back of reproductive rights and all of the different entailments of the Trump presidency with regard to gender. So I think there's that. What's been really, really interesting to me in all of this is to watch, and if I'm being a part of this even a little tiny bit, I'm glad, is to watch people. I think Trump, if governance survives Trump, I think what comes out of it is, we see it in the congressional elections from the fall. What comes out of it is a complete overhaul in our sophistication about governmentality, about governing, about democracy and its vulnerabilities. I talk to people who tell me their life stories. They were never political. They never did anything. They went to church. They took care of their kids. They had their careers, and now this, and they're like completely gobsmacked is the word that something, they've been just totally ravaged by this thing, and they're waking up politically in a moment when they were planning to go off into retirement. So there's that, and so that gives me a tremendous amount of hope that people are learning and they're developing the habitus of being intimately involved with politics at every level of scale, from their home communities to the national level. So, if there's any hope in this, it's that this is very educative, I think, for everybody in the world.
I know there's a few questions still. We are going to hang around for a little while, but I just need to give pause to people who need to wrap up at 2. So please join me in thanking our speaker for all of this.